Good day, everyone. This is Kathleen Newland speaking to you from Washington, D.C. I am the co-founder and a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute. And I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on Resettlement Plus, Clearing the Path to Safety and Opportunity for Refugees. Before we begin the webinar, I want to just remind you of a few logistical details. First of all, let me remind you that the audio from this webinar will be on the MPI website later today. That's migrationpolicy.org/events. And so if you are unable to stay with us throughout the call or want to draw attention to colleagues, please recall that you can hear the audio from the webinar on our website. The report on which some of this webinar is based by Elizabeth Collett, Paul Cluett, and Susan Fratsky is also available on our website. The title is No Way Out, Making Additional Migration Channels Work for Refugees. If you have any technical problems while you're on the webinar, please email events@migrationpolicy.org or call the U.S. number 202-266-1929. And if you're having problems hearing via the web, you can dial in using the call information that was sent to you via email. We're going to have a question and answer session or discussion period at the end of the call. This will not be a voice Q&A, so if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, please type them into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen and send them to the host or email events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet your question to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. I'd like to introduce the presenters for today. First up, we have Elizabeth Collett, who's director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe and a senior advisor to MPI's Transatlantic Council on Migration. She is based in the MPI office in Brussels, MPI Europe, and her work focuses in particular on European migration and immigrant integration policy. Following Liz, we are pleased to have Preeta Law, the Deputy Director in UNHCR's Division of International Protection. Preeta has kindly agreed to stand in for Carol Batchelor, who was called away this morning in Geneva, and we're very grateful to her. She has extensive experience in the field, in Asia, in the Balkans, in Africa, and she has worked on protection issues, including accountability and community-based protection. She is currently covering an extremely relevant topic for today's conversation, which is comprehensive solutions for refugees and protection management within the Division of International Protection at UNHCR. And our third and final speaker will be Paolo Naso, who is a coordinator of the Master's Program in Religion and Intercultural Mediation at La Sapienza, University of Rome, Department of History, Cultures, and Religion. He's also Programs Director of the Federation of Protestant Churches in Italy and Director of a training course for intercultural church leaders. Among his many other professional and service roles, one particularly stands out in the context of today's webinar. That is, he's coordinator of a program called Mediterranean Hope, which is an ecumenical project to monitor Mediterranean migrations and grant shelter to asylum seekers based in Lampedusa and Sicily. And we're very grateful to all of them for joining us today. As you know, we are conducting this webinar in a heightened context of concern about the refugee flows of a size unprecedented since World War II, affecting almost every region of the world. And with these mounting numbers of refugees and asylum seekers, there is an increasing focus on finding solutions for refugees. The traditional solutions are not providing the kind of closure for refugees that they need in order to to rebuild their lives. And so a search for alternative solutions has intensified. And Liz Collett is going to start off by acquainting us with some of the innovative ideas that are being discussed currently and the context in which that discussion is taking place. So let me turn the microphone over to you, Liz.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and it's great to be talking about this today, particularly the day after a ministerial meeting in Geneva to look at pledges for resettlement from a variety of different countries. And while the headline focus was on resettlement pledges themselves, we also heard yesterday a number of governments make commitments on other ways to offer refugees access to alternative solutions than remaining in the first country of asylum, which is where the majority of refugees around the world reside. Things like easing channels for family reunion, creating scholarship programs, or just reducing the administrative barriers that often exist within immigration systems. These focuses are on adaptations that look at actively incorporating refugees into existing immigration programming or reducing barriers to accessing those programs, and in some cases creating new programs that are similar to resettlement but perhaps more nuanced than typical resettlement channels. And the goal, and I recall here a conversation with UNHCR staff 6 months ago, the goal is to allow individuals to become more than just the refugee label and look towards rebuilding their own lives. And that's one of the key goals here. But over the last year in Europe, we've also heard a number of organizations calling for the extension and expansion of legal pathways for refugees in order to allow them an alternative to using the very dangerous informal pathway that many individuals have been using to get to the European Union in the hands of smugglers, many of which lead to injury and in some cases death. So there are a number of different drivers for thinking about additional pathways, and the paper, which you can download from our website, was emanated from a meeting that we co-hosted with UNHCR in preparation for yesterday's Resettlement Plus meeting to look at how different governments might tweak and adapt their existing policies in order to give refugees additional opportunities. In the paper itself, we looked at 3 broad areas of this. First, existing pathways, which can be broken down into 3 main categories: labour mobility, pathways for education, and then family reunification. So what are they, how are they used, how might they be adapted? The second part of the paper looks at the sort of preconditions to mobility. What do refugees need in order to be able to take advantage of those channels and pathways, such as the need for secure status in the first country of asylum, so access to a status that allows you to move full in the knowledge that you won't find yourself in limbo between a country of first asylum and a country of destination, but also the documentation you need to and then access those pathways. And finally, the paper looks at various cross-cutting elements, including new models of resettlement such as private sponsorship, but existing regional frameworks for mobility, the most extensive being in the European Union, but also things like ECOWAS in West Africa and Mercosur in Latin America that have piloted new ways to allow for some adaptation of and pathways for refugees within a particular region of the world. I'm going to focus mostly on that first section and think about the various different channels that currently exist, which sound very simple, but often have particular political, legal, and practical obstacles with respect to applying different pathways to refugee populations. If we look at labour migration channels as they currently exist, there does seem to be a mismatch of the profile of existing refugee populations and the types of programming that is available in most industrialised countries for economic migration. Most immigration systems focus towards high-skilled and the needs of the labour market at the higher, more qualified end, and refugees either lack those skills entirely or lack opportunities to verify the skills that they have. Many have left documentation behind or can't access the institutions in their country of origin to then verify that they do indeed have qualifications and experiences that might be useful. So there's often a barrier there that's very practical in terms of being able to access these channels. Other issues involve information about those programs that exist and being able to make applications in a timely manner. And there have been suggestions that immigration systems designed for high-skilled migrants could improve access to refugees, either by, in the case of point systems around the world, offering an allocation of extra points for people with refugee status so that they rise up through the categories, or really thinking about more proactive skills assessment of refugee populations, which allow countries to be able to assess the real skills held rather than going through formal recognition of qualification processes. And there, I think there's a key role for the private sector and employers in thinking about this. There's also a role for thinking about bridging programs that would allow people to make the gap between the skills they present and the skills that might be needed by a particular country of destination. Also within the labour category, there has been some discussion of how particular and temporary migration programs might be useful to refugee populations. This is thinking about more short-term support, which maintains the status quo. Ultimately, the refugee would remain primary status in the first country of origin. And there have been questions over sustainability of these models. But as a way into self-sufficiency and to maintain and develop skills, they might be considered in the future as part of more regional mobility for refugee populations to allow an increase in earning and skills development. A second area is education. We've seen a rise in the number of scholarship programs in recent years in Germany, the UK, Canada, and the US. And this is positive as it's not only a route out of a first country of asylum, but it's focused on skills development and career development and opening up longer-term opportunities for individuals. The critical challenge is scale. Most scholarship programs are discreetly packaged for a small number of individuals, and each university in each country has their own particular specifications and routes. If you are an individual wishing to study engineering and taking advantage of a scholarship program, which scholarship program do you apply to? There's no single application process. You would have to make a very, very high-risk bet that you would be able to get into the scholarship program of your choice. Information about programs is also a challenge, as well as then meeting those specific requirements of each particular program, such as language, the specific education needs that each program requires, but also more structural issues like financial dependency. Scholarship programs often cover tuition fees and perhaps some basic living expenses, but what kind of stipends are available for the holiday period or to be able to move back and forth. It's been noted that in some cases scholarship programs haven't actually reached their full potential because there has been a disparity between the living costs in a particular country and the amount that's given to scholarship programs. So there are questions about how these might be adapted even further from using online courses as bridging mechanisms to get people into scholarship programs, but also how you might develop scholarship programs alongside apprenticeship programs with employers to allow people to either access work programs in the holidays or to think through then accessing labour mobility programs. There are a lot of different aspects to scholarship programs that I think can be thought through, and an opportunity, I think, for international organisations to perhaps rationalise and create a clearinghouse for all the opportunities available so that it's clear to individuals what is out there. And finally, the third channel is family reunification, which is a political challenge, I think, above all. We've seen in recent months policy changes in Europe linked to delaying or limiting family reunification based on a fear that it is becoming a pull factor for individuals to try to spontaneously claim asylum in the European Union, one member of the family claiming asylum, and then bringing the rest of the family through legal channels. It's been notable in the last couple of months with the increase of women and children coming across the Turkish-Greek route that this decision to limit and delay family reunification may have indeed had a perverse effect in terms of then impelling those family members to take dangerous routes with smugglers rather than waiting many years before they can access family reunification routes. So there may be an argument here for expanding family reunification for specific groups, particularly vulnerable groups, but also expanding the categories and reducing the barriers of access. Some experiences in the United States and Canada in terms of relaxing criteria or speeding up and accelerating processes for family reunification have proved, I think, very useful in the past, and there might be more to consider there. There are lots of different things we could talk about in this area, but I think some of the things that we have to keep in mind are what underpins the barriers to access to many of these pathways. Reducing the time and cost for processing visas while keeping in mind the increased concerns about identification and security that have been raised in recent months, improving the documentation of refugee populations, convention travel documents, and security of status. These things all underpin the ability to realistically access channels. What kind of information and outreach to these populations currently exist, and how might they improve? Here, I think there is a critical role to be played by other actors, non-governmental actors, including the private sector, for generating some of that information. And the question of who is best placed to do what. In terms of skills assessment, it's clearly not something UNHCR is necessarily going to take on. So what organizations might do skills assessments in countries of first asylum to identify potential candidates for labor migration, who would then give pre-departure information and training before people moved. How can all of these different actors fit together in a coherent plan that might improve opportunities for individuals to really, as I said before, become more than just the label of a refugee and to start rebuilding lives that have been halted by conflict and instability.
Liz, and I thank you very much, Liz, and I really recommend those who are able to take a look at the paper that you and Paul Cluett and Susan Fratzke wrote, because there's a great deal more detail. And it makes clear, as your comments did, that there's a lot of thinking about new pathways, that there's lots of experimentation and lots of programs, but I think the big question remains, how do you make these things add up to more than the sum of their parts? And the question of how to make those innovations real and take them to scale is a major question. We are going to turn now to Preeta Law, the Deputy Director of the Division of International Protection at UNHCR. Yesterday, more than 90 governments gathered in Geneva with the Secretary General of the UN, with the High Commissioner for Refugees, obviously, and it was a large and a high-stakes meeting. Preeta, can you tell us how it went yesterday?
Sure. Thank you, Kathleen. Let me maybe begin by saying that I very much like the title of the webinar, where you talk about clearing the path, and I think it's a very good way of describing a little bit the motivation behind the conference that was held yesterday. And then became really the tone that several of the delegations took in the course of their interventions. And I think we had more than 55 delegations from around the world take the floor at the meeting. So I think it was something that has seized the attention of countries everywhere, even those who are not directly involved in responding to the Syrian crisis. But to move on from that to some of what we actually heard and what came out of the discussions at the end, some of you may have seen our press release, so I'll try not to be too repetitive for those of you who have read that, and maybe put a little more detail to that. But I think the High Commissioner, when he closed the meeting, spoke of it as having achieved a sort of recognition of the need for solidarity and responsibility sharing for refugees. And I think there wasn't, from, you know, the several hours that we were all there, any indication from any of the statements that were made by member states that where you felt that that was not an agreement. It was a very broad consensus that this conversation was needed, and in addition to the conversation, that the need of the hour really is about scaling up, as you were pointing to, Kathleen, opportunities for refugees to find solutions that are safe and legal, and for those solutions to still situate them as refugees, safeguard their rights as refugees and their status as refugees, as maybe some of them think about going back one day to Syria when that is possible. So I think that was very much the consensus. I don't think we had any views in the room that differed on the need for this to happen. I think that the other thing that the High Commissioner really stressed to delegates at the closing of, as he closed the meeting, was obviously the wider global displacement context, as we all discussed Syria, that this is the wider displacement context and the challenges ahead that are presented by both the Syria situation and protracted forced displacement in many parts of the world, really needing the global effort at a political settlement for Syria and other ongoing displacement and secondary flows as a result of long-standing conflicts, whether they are large-scale, as we see in Syria, or lesser in their daily appearance on our news channels, but certainly still affecting large numbers of people. And resulting in IDP situations and refugee situations that go on for, you know, now the average being more than 20 years. It's a staggering, actually, figure to think of being in that state of limbo for that long. But to go to some of the very concrete issues, I think we did see progress in several areas, and perhaps you can point to 6 main ones. Most states pledged sort of increases, modest increases in the number of resettlement and humanitarian admissions places. I think you recall that one of the objectives of the meeting was to build on the momentum that has been generated by the commitment for over, I think, 170,000 places, and we moved beyond that. So indeed, we went in the right direction there. So I think the total that came out of that initial count at the end of the meeting is some 150,000 resettlement places. Sorry, 185,000 resettlement places. And many countries offered to significantly increase their global resettlement programs beyond what they are this year and over the course of the next several years. So a recognition that this can't be a one-shot thing, it needs to continue. In addition, the EU committed to resettling additional refugees from Turkey as well. Spain and Iceland are a few examples that I can already speak to, where they're exploring private sponsorship for resettlement using what we had all been hearing about in very good detail from the Canadian delegation the day before the meeting, as well as at the meeting as we kicked off. So people really, member states, building on what they were hearing right there and then, and seeing that as a way for taking their own commitments forward and doing more than they were now. States also affirm their commitment to family reunification, and we heard earlier about the need for that as we see many of the movements that are compelled really by family reunification needs. And because of the inordinate amount of time, the procedures involved, the time that people end up spending in sometimes dangerous environments while they wait for family reunion, just not being tenable anymore, and then they seek other ways of reuniting with family. So there, a broadening of who would constitute family. So looking at that really, so clearing the path again in terms of some of the flexibility arrangements that would be necessary to facilitate that, and easing those procedures. So Ireland talked about, for example, continuing their existing program. Japan and Bahrain spoke to looking at how they can do that differently. And several Latin American and European countries announced new humanitarian visa programs, so not in the more traditional resettlement vein, but really looking at other ways of providing opportunities for safe and legal pathways for refugees to move. And the expansion of existing ones. We heard from Argentina about extending their current program and accelerating procedures linked to that program. Brazil will extend the program it has in place last year for an additional 2 years. So they're really looking at building on what they had put in place and improving it, potentially looking at higher figures as well. Around scholarships, we actually heard a number of states speak to looking at scholarships, other types of educational opportunities as a pathway for refugees from Syria, Russia, Costa Rica. And I think there's a recognition from some of the statements, and certainly for UNHCR, in addition to it providing that in individuals with opportunities, it really does provide refugee communities with this broader sense that their future as a community isn't lost, that young people within their communities are able to, even while they're in this, see it perhaps as a temporary possibility and not a long-term definitive solution, that it does move them towards greater opportunities for the future. So a really important one from, I think, the refugee community perspective and for individuals as well.
Thank you, Preeta. That really gives us a tremendous sense of the variety of approaches that are being sort of proposed and tested. Did yesterday's events give you a real sense of momentum around these?
I think we have the start of real momentum. I think a lot of the discussions, the way it evolved, really did go. Several delegations built upon, as I said, what previous statements, what other delegations had said previous to them. So there was, I think, a coming together, delegations prompting others to do things as well. So it was an interesting dynamic in that sense, and I think that it is the start of that momentum. Of course, everyone in the room is looking to the September events as well, and so certainly this is meant to build up to those. But I would say we definitely do have the beginning of that momentum, and I think a promising one.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. The September event that Preeta referred to is the special session of the United Nations General Assembly, which will be devoted to the to large-scale movements of people and policy approaches toward them. So thank you very, very much, Preeta. We're now going to turn to Paolo Naso, Professor of Political Science at La Sapienza, University of Rome. As I mentioned, he's the coordinator of Mediterranean Hope, which is a project of the Federation of Protestant Churches in Italy, and has also been much involved with other private and civil society efforts to deliver services and, perhaps equally importantly, hope to refugees. So, Paolo, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity. Yes, I think that it makes sense to start from a specific day that was October the 3rd, 2013. You will probably remember that in that day, 368 people died in front of the little isle of Lampedusa. Other similar catastrophe happened also later on and before that day, but in that occasion the tragedy was very evident because it was just in the front of the island. So we have pictures of 368 people dying just because they were migrants. And at that point, I think that there was a bigger conversation, political debate in Italy, how to react to this phenomenon. And unfortunately, 1 year later, nothing happened, but the search and rescue operation, Mare Nostrum, that helped to save thousands of human lives. But in terms of policies, how to manage these massive fluxes of people, nothing happened. So our consideration, also considering the kind of people that were arriving to Lampedusa or Pozzallo, to the other major Italian harbors, was the following. We are witnessing a new phenomenon that is seriously different from the historical migration that also Italy has been experiencing in the last 20-25 years. It's something new. The people who arrive are not pure migrants in the sense that they don't have a clear perspective about their job. They don't have a clear job opportunity in the country where they try to arrive. So it's not the typical migrant that we learned to meet 25 years ago approximately. But at the same time, this kind of people are not classic refugees because, first of all, they are not individual. They are a massive number of persons, and in some situations that they escape from, in strict sense, they cannot be recognized as refugees. So we realized that a new policy had to be tested to try to manage this new dimension of migration that we like to call 2.0. Just to express the fact that it is something new that we have to manage with different tools than from the past. So what to do? And at that point, we started considering a different option. First of all, to try to promote a change of the policies and the legislations, Italian and European legislation about the issue. But of course, this is not realistic in the current political frame in Italy and in Europe. So we decided to try to find a way in the current legislation in order to offer a viable alternative to the smugglers. Everybody knows that a ride with the smugglers from North Africa to Lampedusa costs $3,000, $5,000 per person. Think which kind of traffic and a crime is in this business. It's just an incredible quantity of money we give to the traffickers and the smugglers just because we don't offer alternative paths, safe paths to the migrants. So searching for an alternative, we realized that there were some possibility adopting and interpreting Article 25 on the Schengen Treaty about visa, and in particular about the humanitarian visas. Of course, when the humanitarian visa was established, the consideration was very individual. An individual can apply for a specific humanitarian visa, but since we are facing massive migration, so why not to consider humanitarian visa as an opportunity not for a single individual person, but for a larger number of people? This was the starting point of our protocol, of our discussion, and we raised the question in public debate, and the Federation of Protestant Churches, that is, of course, a small organization in Italy, and with the Community of Sant'Egidio, that is a much larger Catholic organization, together we decided to press our government to offer a broader interpretation of the humanitarian visa. So we started a real political negotiation that was very positive and very responsive. And yesterday, according to my information, Foreign Minister Paolo Gentiloni quoted what we are doing in Italy as a good practice. What we do, basically, we offer humanitarian corridors according to the existing laws in Italy and in Europe, so that the refugees or asylum seekers can apply to an Italian consulate to get this humanitarian visa. Of course, this process is supported and facilitated by our organizers, our facilitators, cultural mediators. The request is processed according to the laws, the Italian and European laws. If the person are really entitled to get this humanitarian visa, they get the visa, they take a flight, a regular flight that is paid by the organizers, so the Federation of Protestant Churches and the Community of Sant'Egidio, and safely arrive in Italy. When in Italy, they have the status of people under humanitarian protection. At that point, they can start their process to be recognized as political refugees, or if this is the case, or other alternatives. This was considered to be a best practice, a specific example how it is possible to create alternative paths to the criminality and the smugglers and the illegal immigration. And what it is very appealing of this model is that in a time of very serious problem about terrorism and infiltration, in this case, all the people who arrive are 3-4 times very well checked and detected. I assume that, first of all, they have a relation with the NGOs who work in the country, then they are processed in the consulate, then they are processed in Italy before they get the visa. When they get the visa, they are fingerprinted in the sending countries, and they are fingerprinted again as soon as they arrive in Italy. So under this aspect, a lot of procedure gives us the sense that this can be considered a very safe process. And what is great is that this example has been made possible by the generosity of the organizations who decide to raise money for that, and in particular one small Protestant organization, a church, the Waldensian Church, offered some money they get from the state according to a special agreement that grants to the religious bodies in Italy significant amount of money from the state. And this church decided to invest a good quantity of this money exactly for this purpose. So this is where we are at the moment, and I can precise that the 3 corridors are from Lebanon first, and 100 people approximately already arrived to Italy through the corridor from Lebanon. A second one will be is operative in Morocco, and this will gather people mainly from West Africa. So again, real migrants 2.0, in the sense that they are not strictly refugees, but they are vulnerable, and vulnerability is the category at the center of the concept of the humanitarian visa. And the third corridor would be from Ethiopia, because especially 2 years ago, people from Eritrea and Sudan arrived to Italy in massive numbers. So it was important for the geopolitical dimension of the problem to consider this specific route from Ethiopia to Italy. The total cases that will be covered under this program, that is again self-funded, is 1,000 people. A very small number, a drop in the ocean, but this can be an example. And the hope of the organizer, and at this point I would say also the hope of the Italian government, is that this good practice could be adopted also by other European countries.
Thank you very much, Paolo. That's really fascinating, and I'm so glad you brought up the alternative pathways for vulnerable migrants who might not fit sort of purely into the category of refugees. That's certainly going to be one of the points of focus for the United Nations conference on September 19th, broadening out a bit beyond refugees to look at other people who are in need of protection, but aren't necessarily falling under the Refugee Convention. And thanks to all the speakers for those very substantive presentations. We're going to move into the discussion period now. Let me remind you that there's no voice Q&A on this webinar, but you can use the chat function on your screen to ask questions. You can write to events@migrationpolicy.org, email your questions, or you can tweet to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. And we have a lot of questions that come in, and just about 20 minutes, so I will get to as many of them as I can. And I'd like to ask our presenters, I'll direct the question to just one of you, and try to keep your answers fairly short if it's possible. So let me start with one very provocative and basic question, which is whether yesterday's meeting in Geneva really showed that most countries are very reluctant to admit large numbers of Syrian refugees, or indeed any other refugees, even if they arrive by regular and organized means. Liz, do you want to take that one on?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, I think we've seen this dynamic in Europe over the last year, both in terms of efforts to kickstart a relocation process for those asylum seekers who've arrived in Greece and Italy, but also in terms of a certain reluctance to invest in resettlement as well. And I think that was very clear yesterday. Very few European states offered anything additional to what they had before. I think it also is, to try and cut the cynicism slightly about what we might see in the future. And there is, I think, also a gap between what states are willing to pledge loudly and what they're willing to do quietly. This is an extremely politically sensitive issue in many national debates. So whether countries are willing to quietly actually get on with either resettlement or developing private sponsorship models or thinking about family reunification, I think they should be encouraged to do so and not necessarily trumpet it if that helps them politically. But we do see some political statements that are extremely negative, and then you find out later that some action is taken on the ground. I think one area of concern is really the EU-Turkey deal, which was agreed a couple of weeks ago, setting aside questions of the viability of that deal in and of itself and the desirability of that deal. it did set out a commitment by the European Union to resettle 1 Syrian for every Syrian that was returned from the Greek islands. And a lot has been made about the nature of that kind of very brutal trade-off between those returned and then those resettled. My own possibly more cynical view is that without that one-for-one commitment, commitments by European states to do resettlement in the context of the EU-Turkey deal may not have been as substantial as the 72,000 they've committed to. And it remains to be seen whether the voluntary humanitarian admission program, which the Commission is working on right now within the EU, would actually kickstart into practice. But the hope is that once the sense of unmanaged flow to the European Union has dissipated somewhat, that states will be able to commit greater numbers to resettlement and other pathways. I have to suggest that politicians tend to have short memories, so once the sense of crisis is over, the real question is, will they then be able to commit to the longer-term imperatives?
Thanks, Liz. And I'm glad you mentioned the EU-Turkey agreement. We had a question come in about that, which you have now answered. So thank you very much. Preeta, one listener asked if you would elaborate briefly on what's meant by broadening out what's understood as family for family reunification purposes. Could you address that?
Sure. I think, from the UNHCR perspective, we have our sense of that, but I think there's governments are now recognizing that it's broadening out categories, looking at new categories and making them eligible for family reunion, where, as perhaps some of your listeners know, that the categories are fairly not necessarily representative of how many communities and groups think of family. So broadening it out in that sense, but also looking at how flexibly the procedures, how more flexible those procedures can be made, or how they could be less difficult for people in very constrained environments to access those procedures. So the kinds of documentation needed to be able to be reunified when you've lost documentation, or and are not able to use that to prove your relationships. Being able to also look at the costs of applications through those procedures when people have found their very few resources diminish over a period of time, especially given that some of this takes so long. So, and then the sponsorship piece of that maybe broadening the categories that can be reunified with family would come with some arrangements for sponsorship, where a family that may have only very recently been resettled or otherwise been granted asylum as a refugee in another country is not in a position to provide the sponsorship because they're just finding their own feet. So those kinds of ways of, building up that particular aspect of as an admission pathway that is quicker and more accessible, enabling the access to it more broadly as well.
Right. So we're talking about extended family, about aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, others who are not inside this sort of narrow nuclear family framework. Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions about private sponsorship, and I know this is something that you addressed, Paolo. One question is, are there any downsides to this new level of interest in private sponsorship? Do you see any potential problems there, Paolo?
I think this is a great opportunity. our experience is that as soon as the corridor was open, we got incredible answer and reaction by the civil society. Now there is a big discussion in Germany about the policy of Chancellor Merkel, but I remember that when the first massive group of people arrived to Germany, the welcome of political leaders, of ordinary people, church leaders, religious leaders were very, very positive. There was an incredible attitude to welcome the people, to grant full support to the policy of welcome by the government. So this is something that I consider the big chance of this program. The fact is that the private sponsorship can really create a major sense of responsibility of the society, and can offer the vivid witnesses of how the people can make the difference, activating courses for language, activating programs for children. Another element of this discussion is the fact that we have to consider that 15% of those who arrive by the smugglers by boat, 15% are unaccompanied minors, teenagers. So it means that really, as a civil society, can play a much more important role on under one condition: the fact is that there is a clear and strong leadership in creating the motivation, the right atmosphere to make this as an opportunity and not as a problem.
Thank you. I'd like to just follow up on that. There was a question about getting beyond state-sponsored resettlement, about how faith communities can assist families and individuals. I think you've largely answered that in your remarks just now and in your presentation, Paolo. But are there other programs that you're aware of that faith communities are organizing that might tap into that broad public goodwill that you just mentioned? My concern is that goodwill can easily get dissipated if there isn't a way for people to channel it into organized programs.
Absolutely, I agree. The goodwill is not enough. There is not a clear and strong political leadership. I think that the major issue is to change the public discourse, the political discourse in Europe, especially on this issue. Now, the peoples, the European peoples, are of course worried and threatened by the issue of terrorism, criminality, economic crisis. And migration is the easy answer to all of these problems and challenges. It is not the case. Migration can be a resource for the life of the national communities, as it has been in the past, and also refugee can offer a wonderful example of integration. So we have the very good experience from the past. It's just a time for a new political determination and a new narrative. Unfortunately, media, education don't do enough to offer the good part of the story of the migrants and of the refugees arriving to Europe. And this will be a serious problem in the long time, because the negative feeling will stay, and the migrants will stay without a political solution in their own country. So we are forced, in one way or another, to adapt to this situation. It is the time to change the attitude to the problem.
Thank you very much. Preeta, I want to come back to you. One listener expressed the concern that in some countries, at least, Syrians moving under these new programs might be ineligible for the normal services that are made available to refugees. That person who posed that question was wondering how, what might be the best ways to advocate that Syrians should be eligible for refugee assistance and integration programs, regardless of how they enter a country.
That's a very good question, and I think a very important issue for us as we look at additional, complementary pathways for admission of Syrian refugees to really keep very front and center, so that we really don't set Syrian refugees up to fail in integration or to fail in being able to see this as a solution for them in the longer term, and also ensure that we address some of the questions that the issues that Paolo highlighted. And I think that there is, in some of what we heard from the Canadians, for example, as they talked about how they set up the program that they just achieved in an amazing record, really in record time, they've really, I think, got a bit of a formula as to how to do that. And certainly within a much more structured program where they're coming in under a sort of humanitarian missions program, but they really outlined how the engagement with local communities is so important, ensuring that people can work, and some fundamentals are taken care of very early on. And I think those are not very difficult to do fundamentals. They're more about very basic everyday things that we all want taken care of in our lives: employment, education, and health. If you can look at those three core areas to ensure that Syrians coming in through complementary pathways also have access to those services as a resettled Syrian refugee would have, I think then we can certainly see them being on the right path for integration and a successful engagement in the new community. So I think your speaker is very right to point out the importance of that. And I think it's on people's radars to ensure that that is something we look at very carefully. And the public-private partnerships facilitate that.
Mm-hmm. Great. There's a somewhat related question which I'd like to direct to Liz, and again, slightly provocative. The question is, do you think NGOs and IGOs, that is intergovernmental organizations, are best placed to assess the risk and needs of refugees at the pinch points like Greece, Turkey, Italy? Or should EU member states rather turn to family welfare organizations and the state organizations that have statutory responsibilities for child protection to take the lead? What do you think, Liz?
You always ask the hard questions of me.
IGOs or other kinds of organizations?
Well, right now, if we're talking about Greece, I think any help at all would be quite welcome. I think there's a problem right now of resources most generally. Certainly, I've heard this concern expressed before that the situation of many vulnerable people in Greece, whether on the islands or whether it's either mainly, creates I think a systemic challenge for the Greek government. How do you deal with the challenges that this population presents? Personally, I would go with the cop-out answer, which would be both at this stage in Greece. So I would say that I think there are some concerns that the volunteer networks that have sprung up over the last few months in the Greek islands need to be very well coordinated if they're going to carefully address those needs under the sort of the aegis of some of the larger organisations who are already there, to avoid either duplication or gaps in service provision to emerge. I think that has been a big challenge, is consistency, despite the enthusiasm that many have shown. But I also question whether right now, and I speak specifically to Greece, whether the government has the capacity to respond in the way that would be necessary given all the other capacity issues they've been facing in other elements of the asylum process.
Yeah, so all hands on deck there. Just in relation to that, Liz, if I could just ask you to continue for a moment on a slightly different, when as you're making the point that anyone who has capacity needs to be pitching in on these issues. We have this is a question that came in. We have UNHCR itself, as well as Médecins Sans Frontières, Médecins du Monde, the International Rescue Committee, and others who have said they are ceasing or suspending their activities in the Greek hotspots because they don't agree with the use of those hotspots as detention centers. How do you think that is going to play into this mosaic of different kinds of organizations working with these populations?
I mean, I can completely understand where the NGOs and the international organizations are coming from when they make a very principled stand about something they're concerned about in terms of the conditions in those centers that were not set up to become detention centers, and certainly not within a week or two, or with the limited resources available on the center. And I think there are huge question marks about the standards. However, I think as time goes on, it will get harder and harder in terms of conditions for the individuals there. I don't really, having not been there recently, I can't really speak to the conditions and what's the best thing to do. So I'm not entirely sure I'm the best placed person to answer this, but maybe our colleague from UNHCR can speak to it.
Okay, that's great, and I would like to give Preeta a chance to weigh in there. And indeed, as we are actually officially out of time, but I'll take a few more minutes to give each of the speakers a chance to make just another brief intervention, if you would like to either sum up or make a point that you feel hasn't been brought out. And perhaps you could address that question, Preeta, about working in or with the Hotspots program and its new manifestation. There was also a question about the differences in treatment between Syrian refugees and other refugees, which some of you might want to bring into your final remarks. So, Preeta, let's go to you for the first of those wrap-ups.
Sure. Thank you, Kathleen. Just very quickly then, I think on the last point, what international and non-governmental organizations are saying they can and cannot do in these hotspot locations, particularly Greece. I think it's very fundamental to UNHCR's policy on detention and where we are not in a position to really be involved in detention facilities and facilitating detention, where detention is perhaps not a really, it's a first recourse in this instance when it doesn't need to be the approach that is taken. So that's very fundamentally what it comes down to for us, and I think Liz spoke to that. But I think also just to say that this, of course, doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of other things that UNHCR and all our partners, our NGO and other partners, are doing to support the capacity of the Greek authorities to respond broadly on the protection and assistance needs of people who are in the refugees in Greece in the hotspot locations and around them, because that's still ongoing work. There's been no ceasing of those kinds of activities, which are really very essentially about ensuring the safety and well-being of refugees there. So I think it's we've taken a very clear position with our partners on some aspects, but there's a lot of other work to support the Greek authorities that continues. And I think I just want to very quickly say that this idea that should it be IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, or NGOs, or should it be government, UNHCR's approach, not just here in the context of the European situation, but more broadly, is really that by definition, our role is to support the the responsibilities of states. So we support states take up their responsibilities with respect to refugee assistance, protection, and that continues whether it's in the European context or elsewhere. So certainly, as Liz said, it's both, but with responsibility really sitting with the states.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to Paolo now to see if you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with us.
Yes, I would like to stay on the issue of the hotspot, because Italy had the privilege to have the first hotspot in Europe in Lampedusa, and I can simply witness that it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it is too simplistic to judge the people according to the country they originate from. If you are from Syria, you're okay. If you are from Mali, you are not. Why? I mean, in Mali, there is a very serious crisis at this moment. There are some countries like Somalia that really simply collapse. So how can we decide, not considering the personal story of the people, how can we judge the destiny of these people simply from the origin that they are from the country they arrive from? It is a very simplistic tool that has been adopted, and after that it is decided that some people have to be expelled because they cannot stay in the country because they don't have right to go through the process to be recognized as refugees. What happened to these people? In most cases, it simply does happen nothing, and we generate illegal migrants that can eventually be an even bigger problem. So I think that the hotspots are not in practice the right answer to the issue. And my final consideration is about this polarization between the state intervention and the role of NGOs. I would say I would be very ecumenical, so to say, in the sense that I think that it is exactly the time for a new covenant between institutions, stakeholders, and civil society. I mean, the implication of a comprehensive policy of integration are so many that just creating a good link between different actors is possible to go to positive solution. After what we are experiencing in many European countries, I mean, the failure of historical policies of integration, we really need a new start, and in this new start we need the new actors. So the contribution of different actors is very strategical to me.
Thank you. Those are really extremely important points that you've made. So thank you for that. And I will turn finally for the last word to Liz Collett.
Well, I would certainly support that view that many actors need to be involved, and for one specific reason. And we've talked about a meeting yesterday where governments put on the table either resettlement pledges or other ways in which they would facilitate pathways for refugees to restart their lives. But now the real work begins to actually affect that. And as we talked about earlier, scaling up will be a huge challenge, but for many countries that put pledges on the table, and certainly many more countries within Europe who are under an obligation to think about resettlement to some extent over the next few months, or even relocation, there's been a huge task for UNHCR and more experienced governments to really transfer their knowledge and expertise, but also think about how best to accomplish these goals and bring in as much knowledge from outside of government as possible. So collaboration is not just going to be beneficial, it's going to be absolutely necessary if there's going to be follow-through on many of the commitments made. And it may be worth bearing in mind that for governments with less experience on resettlement, thinking about additional pathways may be easier to do in the shorter term as they scale up resettlement programs and try to use the existing channels that exist rather than reinventing the wheel in a situation of acute need.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thanks to all all three of these outstanding speakers, and thanks to our audience for sticking with us beyond our allotted time. I apologize to those of you whose questions we weren't able to get to. Got to as many as we could in the time allotted, plus a few minutes. And let me remind you that the audio from today's webinar will be available at migrationpolicy.org events. And you can also find the related report by Liz, Paul Cluett, and Susan Pratsky on our website. It's called No Way Out, Making Additional Migration Channels Work for Refugees. Liz has also written an excellent commentary specifically on the EU-Turkey refugee deal called The Paradox of the EU-Turkey refugee deal, which is also available on our website. Finally, I'd encourage you to look at our webpage, Moving Europe Beyond Crisis. It has a data tool that shows asylum applications by country in the EU and the European Free Trade Area and by nationality for 2008 through 2015. It's available at the URL you see on your screen. For any reporters on the call who have further questions, please call Michelle Mittelstadt or you can email her at mmittelstadt@migrationpolicy.org. Thanks to all of you for participating, and we will certainly be offering further resources addressing this extremely important issue. Thank you and goodbye from Washington.